Welcome, dear friends, to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I cannot tell you how much joy it brings me to know you choose to spend your evenings with these stories. Each tale takes time and love to prepare, but your kindness and the way our little community grows make it all some meaningful. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. If you haven't yet, do subscribe so you never miss a new mystery. Now let's gently turn the page and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. Wit and a Judge. The parish hall of St. Mary Mead wore its best face that April afternoon. Bunting and faded pastels draped the windows, and the long trestle tables gleamed with starched white cloths that smelled faintly of lavender and iron. Upon these snowy expanses stood the pride of the Women's Institute. Teapots of every description, from Mrs. Bantry's grandmother's Georgian silver to Miss Weatherby's cheerful brown Betty, each attended by its own plate of biscuits or slice of sponge. Miss Marple, seated near the window with a view of both the hall and the kitchen hatch, adjusted her spectacles and surveyed the scene with the mild interest of one who has witnessed many such gatherings. The light through the glass was kind, softening the worn floorboards and lending a golden glow to the assembled company. She had chosen her position with care, as was her habit, finding it always useful to observe the comings and goings without appearing to do so. Lady Bantry, whom Miss Marple still thought of fondly as Dolly, despite the years and the title, was holding court at the next table, her robust voice carrying across the hall. Of course, when I heard the WI, I had secured an actual tea buyer from Reading. I told Colonel Bantry, we simply must attend. Not every day one gets professional judgment on one's brewing habits. What? Mrs. Agatha Reeve, the formidable convener of the tea committee, stood near the judge's table with the bearing of a general surveying troops before battle. She was a tall woman with iron gray hair dressed in severe waves, and she wore her authority over the Women's Institute, as some women wear pearls constantly and with considerable weight. Her fingers drummed upon the table edge, betraying a nervousness at odds with her commanding presence. I do hope Mr. Hartley appreciates the effort we've gone to, Mrs. Reeve said, addressing no one in particular, but clearly intending everyone to hear. Our house blend took 3 months to perfect, 3 months of sampling and adjusting the proportions. The object of this anxiety, Mr. Peril Hartley, had arrived punctually at 3, and now occupied the place of honor at the head table. He was a neat, compact man of perhaps 50 years, with the brisk manner of one accustomed to making swift judgments and moving on. His dark suit was well cut but practical, and he had declined the offered chair cushion with a shake of his head. Before him lay a small leather notebook and a fountain pen, both of which he consulted with the gravity of a scholar examining ancient texts. Miss Marple observed him with interest. There was something in the set of his mouth, a certain tightness that suggested a man who found fault more readily than favor. His hand, when he lifted the first cup, was steady and professional, but there was no warmth in his manner, as Mrs. Reeve hovered anxiously nearby. Milk? Mrs. Reeve inquired, hovering with a small jug. After, said Mr. Hartley curtly. Always after. The leaf must be allowed to express itself fully before the addition of dairy. Surely that is elementary. Mrs. Reeve's color heightened, but she stepped back with admirable restraint, watching as he sipped, considered, and made a notation in his book. His expression gave nothing away, but his pen moved decisively across the page. Near the kitchen hatch, Miss Marple noticed another woman watching the proceedings with even greater intensity than Mrs. Reeve. This was Mrs. Hilda March, proprietress of the newly opened March tea rooms on the High Street. She was a small, anxious-looking woman in her mid-30s, dressed with careful attention in a blue frock that had perhaps been purchased specifically for this occasion. Her hands twisted together as she watched Mr. Hartley, and even from her position by the window, Miss Marple could detect the nervous energy radiating from her. Fresh cup, please, Mr. Hartley announced, pushing the first aside without ceremony. From the kitchen. I prefer to taste each offering at proper temperature. Mrs. March started forward almost before he had finished speaking, disappearing through the kitchen doorway with an eagerness that suggested desperation rather than mere helpfulness. "Poor thing," murmured Dolly, following Miss Marple's gaze. "I hear the tea room isn't doing as well as hoped. Griselda mentioned something about it at the vicarage last week. Competition from the new cafe near the station, I gather." Miss Marple said nothing, but she filed this information away in the manner of one who understands that the smallest details often prove most significant. She had observed Mrs. March in the post office queue some weeks earlier, deep in conversation with Miss Hartnell about the proper order of tea-making. "I was raised milk first," Mrs. March had said firmly. "Mother always insisted it prevented cracking the china. Yet here she was serving at an event where such habits would surely be scrutinized." The hall had filled considerably since their arrival. The Reverend Clement had appeared briefly to offer blessings upon the enterprise before retreating to his study, but his wife Griselda remained, dispensing her particular brand of cheerful chaos. Dr. Haydock sat near the door, his medical bag at his feet, having stopped by on his rounds. Even Inspector Slack had put in an appearance, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes, but clearly present in an official capacity to ensure the event's smooth running. Agatha Earns, a young woman with theatrical gestures and a mobile, expressive face, was assisting with the serving. This was Miss Sylvia Cribb, whose amateur dramatic performances at the parish hall were legendary, if not always for the right reasons. She wore a flowing scarf despite the warmth of the afternoon, and her movements had the studied grace of one perpetually aware of an audience. Mr. Edwin Pike, the hall's caretaker, fussed about the electrical sockets with unnecessary vigor, checking connections and muttering about overloaded circuits. He was a thin, precise man who took his responsibilities with excessive seriousness, and he had already interrupted the proceedings twice, to adjust the positioning of the large folding tea trolley that stood near the kitchen door. "That trolley wants minding," he announced to anyone who would listen. "The stay is particular. It must be set just so or the arm won't hold. I've told them and told them." "Yes, thank you, Pike," said Mrs. Reeve with barely concealed irritation. "I'm sure it's perfectly safe." Miss Marple's attention returned to Mr. Hartley, who had received his fresh cup from Mrs. March and was subjecting it to the same critical examination as the first. He sipped, paused, and then his face settled into an expression of distinct disapproval. "Overdrawn," he said, not troubling to lower his voice. "And milk first, unless I am much mistaken. The color tells the tale, most unsatisfactory." He scribbled something in his notebook with decisive strokes. Mrs. March, still standing beside him, had gone quite pale. Her hand rose to her face, and Miss Marple, whose eyes were remarkably sharp despite her years, noticed something odd. The young woman's cheek bore what appeared to be a tear track, but it caught the light strangely with an almost oily sheen. As Miss Marple watched, Mrs. March pressed a handkerchief to her face, and the white linen came away with a faint gleam. "How curious," thought Miss Marple, reaching for her seed cake. Tears to tea judging, and tears that do not quite behave as natural tears should. She filed this observation away with the others, her fingers busy with her plate, but her mind decidedly occupied elsewhere. The parish hall hummed with genteel conversation, the clink of china, and the comfortable sounds of an English afternoon tea. No one present could have guessed that within the quarter hour that pleasant scene would be shattered by a scream that would echo through St. Mary Mead for months to come. Chapter 2. A scream from the kitchen. The clock on the parish hall wall showed 17 minutes to 4 when the sound came. It was not, Miss Marple reflected afterwards, a sound that belonged to any proper afternoon gathering. Indeed, it was not a sound that belonged to human experience at all, except perhaps in those modern wireless programs that Hernafew Raymond so enjoyed, with their talk of science and machinery. It was high and piercing, A sustained shriek that seemed to drill through the comfortable chatter and the gentle clink of teacups with the force of something utterly alien. For a moment, the entire hall froze. Teacups halted halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Mrs. Reeves' commanding presence faltered as she turned towards the source of that unearthly wail. "The kettle," someone cried. "Miss Weatherby," Miss Marple thought, though in the confusion it was difficult to be certain. "The kettle's boiling over." The spell broke. Several people moved at once. Lady Bantry rose from her chair with an energy that belied her years. Dr. Haydock was already on his feet, his professional instincts engaged. Inspector Slack, who had been sampling a piece of Victoria sponge with evident satisfaction, set down his plate and moved towards the kitchen with the purposeful stride of authority. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting with practiced efficiency, followed at a more measured pace. Her heart, she noticed with some irritation, was beating rather faster than it should. Age brought many inconveniences, but surely a shrieking kettle need not be counted among life's more alarming incidents. Yet something in that sound had been wrong, quite wrong. The kitchen door stood open, swinging slightly on its hinges. Just beyond the threshold, a terrible tableau presented itself. Mr. Percival Hartley lay crumpled on the worn linoleum, his neat dark suit now disordered, one arm flung out as though he had reached for something in his fall. Beside him, the large folding tea trolley that Mr. Pike had fussed over earlier stood at an odd angle, its hinge tray arm hanging loose where it should have been secured. The heavy wooden arm designed to swing outward when the trolley was open for service had clearly been the instrument of disaster. It hung now at shoulder height, precisely level with the ugly mark already darkening on Mr. Hartley's temple. On the bench beyond, an electric kettle hummed with mundane innocence, its element glowing faintly through the water within. No steam issued from its spout. No whistle could be seen attached to its mechanism. Yet that scream still echoed in Miss Marple's ears with uncomfortable persistence. Dr. Haydock was already kneeling beside the fallen man, his fingers seeking the pulse point at the throat with professional swiftness. His face, when he looked up, was grave. Alive, but insensible. The blow was substantial. Here at the temple, you see, a flat impact delivered with considerable force. Inspector Slack examined the tea trolley with the suspicious eye of one who has learned to trust nothing at first glance. He lifted the hanging arm experimentally, testing its weight. Heavy piece of equipment? If the locking stay gave way while he was standing close, it could certainly deliver such a blow. He glanced at Pike, who had appeared in the doorway, looking pale and stricken. "You maintain this trolley, Pike. When did you last check the mechanism?" Pike's thin face worked with distress. "This morning, Inspector, I oiled the hinge and tested the stay myself. It was secure. I made certain of it." "Well, it's not secure now," Slack observed grimly. He crouched to examine the point where the stay should have engaged. Strange, though. No obvious sign of metal fatigue or breakage. It simply came loose. Behind them, Mrs. March had begun to weep with an intensity that filled the small kitchen. Her sobs were ragged and uncontrolled, her whole body shaking with the force of her distress. Miss Cribb hovered nearby, making ineffectual soothing noises, while Mrs. Reeve looked on with an expression combining concern and faint disapproval. "I should have checked it myself," Mrs. March gasped between sobs. "I was just here just moments ago bringing him his staya. If I had noticed, if I had seen the stay was loose, this would never have happened." Lady Bantry, practical as ever, had fetched a chair from the hall. "Come now, Mrs. March, sitting down is what you need. Can't have you fainting as well." Miss Marple moved forward to assist, taking Mrs. March's elbow and guiding her to the offered seat. The younger woman collapsed into it gratefully, pressing her handkerchief to her face with trembling hands. As she did so, Miss Marple felt the brief contact of that handkerchief against her own gloved hand, where it supported Mrs. March's arm. The sensation was distinctly odd. The handkerchief was damp, certainly, but the moisture had a slippery quality, quite unlike the salt water of natural tears. It left a faint film on the fabric of Miss Marple's glove, and with it came a scent, sweet, slightly oily, oddly familiar. Where had she encountered it before? There, Miss Marple murmured, her tone soothing even as her mind catalogued these curious details. A dreadful shock for everyone. Dr. Haydock was issuing instructions for Mr. Hartley's removal to the cottage hospital. Carefully now, keep his head stable. I'll telephone ahead and have them prepare. As willing hands moved to assist, Miss Marple found her gaze drawn to the tea trolley once more. Inspector Slack had moved away to organize the patient's transport, and in the momentary quiet, she stepped closer to examine the mechanism that had apparently failed so catastrophically. The trolley was an old but serviceable piece, the sort found in church halls and village establishments throughout England. Its hinged arm was designed to fold flat against the main frame when not in use, held in place by a simple metal stay that should catch in a notch when the trolley was opened. The principle was sound enough. Miss Marple had seen such contrivances 100 times, but this day troubled her. There was something about the hinge point where the metal met wood. She bent closer, her eyes sharp behind their spectacles. Yes, there. A tiny fragment of something dark clung to the metal. It was brittle and blackened, no larger than a match head, but quite distinct against the brass fitting. Charred, that was the word, as though something had burned there very recently and very locally. Miss Marple straightened, her expression thoughtful. Her gaze traveled from the hinge to the windowsill beyond, where the tea apparatus had been arranged for the afternoon service. Among the pots and canisters stood a small spirit lamp of the old-fashioned kind, used presumably to keep a second pot warm. Its tin casing showed a fresh brown mark along one side, and the wick, she noticed, looked newly trimmed. Making room there, Inspector Slack announced, returning his attention to the kitchen proper. Everyone out, if you please. This is now the scene of an accident, and I'll need to take proper statements. The company began to file out into the hall, where the cheerful bunting now seemed grotesquely inappropriate. Mrs. March was led away by Miss Cribb, still sobbing. Mrs. Reeve followed with stiff dignity. Pike lingered in the doorway, wringing his hands and muttering about the impossibility of equipment failure. Miss Marple paused in the doorway, glancing back at the scene. The kettle hummed on, innocent and electric. The trolley stood crooked where tragedy had struck, and on the draining board, she noted, sat 2 teacups awaiting washing, 2 cups that Mr. Hartley had tasted and dismissed. Lady Bantry touched her arm. Dreadful business, Jane. Come and sit down. You look quite pale. Do I, my dear? Perhaps I do. Miss Marple allowed herself to be led back to their table, but her finger sought her handkerchief in her handbag, the one that bore that faint, slippery residue. She lifted it delicately and sniffed. Theater glycerine. That was what the scent reminded her of. Years ago, when the Amateur Dramatic Society had staged that rather unfortunate production of East Lynne, the leading lady had used just such a preparation for her tear-stained scenes. Makes them shine so convincingly under the lights, she had explained backstage. How very interesting, Miss Marple thought, folding the handkerchief carefully away. How very interesting indeed. The hall had erupted into shocked speculation, voices rising and falling in waves of conjecture, but Miss Marple sat quiet amidst the tumult, her needles clicking steadily, her mind turning over kettles that could not whistle, stays that came loose without breaking, and tears that smelled of the theater rather than sorrow. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices glycerin. The parish hall had taken on the peculiar atmosphere that follows unexpected calamity. Small groups clustered at the trestle tables, speaking in hushed tones that somehow seemed louder than normal conversation. The bunting drooped as though in sympathy, and the teapots, still warm, sat abandoned like relics of a more innocent time that had ended mere minutes ago. Miss Marple had resumed her seat by the window, though her knitting lay idle in her lap. Lady Bantry had gone to assist the vicar's wife with the dispersing of those members of the Women's Institute who were not required for Inspector Slack's inquiries. Through the window, Miss Marple could see Dr. Haydock's motor car departing for the cottage hospital, its passenger a worrying burden. Mrs. March remained in the hall, seated now at a table near the kitchen door under the watchful eye of Miss Cribb. Her weeping had subsided to occasional shuddering gasps, but her distress appeared undiminished. She clutched her handkerchief as though it were a lifeline, pressing it repeatedly to her eyes and cheeks. Miss Marple rose with a careful deliberation of one whose joints require advanced notice of movement, and made her way across the hall. Mrs. Reeve was holding forth near the serving table about the unpredictability of equipment and the impossibility of preventing every mishap. But Miss Marple paid her no attention. Her focus was entirely upon the small, crumpled figure of Hilda March. "Mrs. March, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, approaching the table. "Such a dreadful shock. Perhaps a glass of water would help." Mrs. March looked up, her face blotched and her eyes red-rimmed. "Oh, Miss Marple, it was horrible. Perfectly horrible. If only I had noticed something wrong with that trolley. I was right there, you see, bringing him his tea." "Of course you were. Most distressing to have witnessed such a thing." Miss Marple settled herself into the adjacent chair with a sympathetic murmur. "One feels so helpless in these situations. I keep thinking, if only I had been more careful, more observant." Mrs. March's voice caught on a sob, and she pressed the handkerchief to her face once more. Miss Marple's hand, reaching out in a gesture of comfort, found Mrs. March's arm. The contact was brief but sufficient. Through the thin fabric of her glove, she felt again that curious, slippery sensation as the younger woman's handkerchief brushed against her. The sweet, oily scent was unmistakable now that she was attending to it. Not the clean salt of genuine tears, but something manufactured, something designed to mimic grief rather than express it. "There now," Miss Marple said, her voice retaining its gentle quality even as her mind sharpened with interest. "You mustn't blame yourself. Accidents will happen, as they say, though it's always unfortunate when they do." Miss Cribb, who had been hovering with the anxious air of one uncertain of her role, leaned forward. Her theatrical scarf had become somewhat disheveled in the confusion, and she adjusted it with fingers that trembled slightly. "Poor Hilda has been under such strain," Miss Cribb announced, as though delivering a line to an audience. "The tea room, you know. Such a venture for a woman alone, and then to have Mr. Hartley here today with the power to make or break her reputation." "Sylvia, please," Mrs. March whispered, though whether in gratitude or reproach it was difficult to say. Miss Marple tilted her head with mild inquiry. "I had not realized the stakes were quite so high. But then, in a small community like ours, reputation is indeed everything." "Oh, it is, Miss Marple. It truly is." Mrs. March's hands twisted the handkerchief into a damp rope. "I had hoped, you see, that Mr. Hartley might say something encouraging, something I could use in my advertisement in the parish magazine. A professional recommendation would have meant so much. And instead there was this tragic accident," Miss Marple observed quietly. Yes, exactly." Mrs. March's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Though I suppose now he won't be writing anything at all about anyone's tea." The statement hung in the air with an unfortunate quality. Miss Cribb looked uncomfortable, and even Mrs. March herself seemed to realize the awkwardness of her words. She flushed and began to weep anew. "I didn't mean it like that. Oh, what must you think of me? The poor man lying injured, and here I am thinking of my own concerns." "Shock makes us all say things we don't quite mean," Miss Marple said soothingly. She paused, then added with apparent casualness, "That's a very effective handkerchief you have there. The dampness hardly seems to dry at all." Mrs. March glanced down at the crumpled linen in her hands as though seeing it for the first time. "Oh, I suppose I've been crying rather a lot." Tears do have a way of flowing freely in moments of crisis. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Miss Cribb with polite interest. "I believe you're involved with the Dramatic Society, Miss Cribb. My nephew Raymond is quite enthusiastic about the theater." Miss Cribb brightened visibly at this turning conversation. "Oh, yes, indeed. We're planning a production of The Importance of Being Earnest for the summer fete. I'm to play Lady Bracknell." Such a delicious role. How exciting. The theater requires such specific skills, doesn't it? I remember seeing a production once where the actress used some sort of preparation to make her tears appear more visible under the stage lighting. "Glycerin," Miss Cribb said promptly, then flushed. That is to say, some performers do use such aids for particularly emotional scenes, though, of course, the truly talented have no need of such artifice. Mrs. March had gone very still, her handkerchief frozen halfway to her face. Miss Cribb, seemingly oblivious to the sudden tension, continued with enthusiasm. "I may have mentioned the technique to Hilda some weeks ago. There was that photographer from the Reading Herald doing a feature on new businesses, and Hilda wanted to look appropriately earnest for the portrait. I suggested just a tiny dab, you understand, for the camera. It does add such a shine to the eyes." "For the camera," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "How practical." "It was only a suggestion," Mrs. March said quickly. "Too quickly, perhaps, for photographs," as Sylvia said. "I never actually used it." "Of course not, my dear. Why ever would you?" Miss Marple's tone was utterly without suspicion. Yet somehow the statement invited rather than discouraged further explanation. Mrs. March seemed to collapse inwards lightly. "I suppose I may have tried it once or twice just to see the effect. Sylvia was kind enough to give me a small vial from her theatrical supplies." "How generous." Miss Marple drew out her own handkerchief, the one that bore the faint residue from their earlier contact, and dabbed delicately at her nose. The sweet scent rose to meet her, confirmation of what she already knew. Inspector Slack emerged from the kitchen at that moment, his notebook in hand, and his expression thunderous. "Right then, I'll need statements from everyone who was in or near the kitchen between 3 and the incident." "That includes you, Mrs. March." Mrs. March rose unsteadily, the handkerchief still clutched in her hand. As she passed Miss Marple's chair, a drop of moisture fell from the saturated linen and landed on the tablecloth. It sat there, refusing to soak into the fabric, maintaining its rounded shape with an oily iridescence in the afternoon light. Miss Marple observed this with the attention she might have given to a particularly interesting species of garden pest. The drop did not behave as water should. It remained discreet and gleaming, a tiny bead of manufactured emotion. After Mrs. March had been led away to give her statement, Miss Cribb leaned closer to Miss Marple with a conspiratorial air of one sharing privileged information. "Poor Hilda. She's been quite desperate, you know. The tea room is barely breaking even, and there have been whispers about her ordering practices. Some say she's been economizing rather too much on her supplies." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. And Mr. Hartley was the sort who had noticed such things. He had a reputation for being brutally honest in his assessments. Miss Cribb lowered her voice further. "I heard him tell Mrs. Reeve that her house blend was overdrawn, and that someone had put milk in first, which apparently is quite wrong for proper tasting." Miss Marple's fingers, which had been smoothing a handkerchief, stilled. "Milk first. How curious. I had understood Mr. Hartley to be quite particular about adding milk after the tea." "Oh, he was absolutely insistent, which is why he was so annoyed when he tasted it in his cup. Said it spoiled the entire evaluation." Through the window, the afternoon sun slanted low across the churchyard, gilding the ancient stones with warmth. But here in the parish hall, among the abandoned teapots and nervous witnesses, Miss Marple felt the distinct chill of questions unanswered and observations yet to be properly understood. She folded her handkerchief carefully and returned it to her handbag. making a mental note of everything it represented. Glycerin, theatrical tears, a photograph for the newspaper, and somewhere in all of this, a kettle that should not have screamed and a trolley that should not have failed. The pieces were there, scattered like tea leaves in a cup. It was simply a matter of reading them correctly. Chapter 4, 2 Cups, 1 Habit. Inspector Slack had commandeered the small vestry room adjacent to the hall for his interviews, and the procession of witnesses filing in and out lent the afternoon an air of grim bureaucracy, quite at odds with the Women's Institute's original intentions. Miss Marple, having given her own brief statement concerning the scream and its aftermath, found herself at liberty to observe the general disarray. The kitchen remained closed. A length of rope stretched across the doorway in lieu of proper police tape. Through the opening, Miss Marple could see the draining board where 2 teacups still sat awaiting attention. They had been pushed aside in the emergency, forgotten in the more pressing concern for Mr. Hartley's welfare, but they had not been washed. Lady Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's elbow, slightly breathless from her organizational efforts. "Well, Jane, what a to-do. Half the committee wants to cancel the remainder of the event, and the other half insists we must carry on in Mr. Hartley's honor. Though what an hour there is in serving tea after a man's been struck down beside the trolley, I cannot fathom. People do cling to routine in times of distress," Miss Marple observed. "It provides a sense of normality when events become abnormal." "I suppose so." Dolly lowered her voice. "Inspector Slack seems to think it was a straightforward accident. Faulty equipment, unfortunate timing, that sort of thing. Pike is beside himself, naturally. Keeps insisting he checked everything this morning." Miss Marple made a noncommittal sound. Her gaze remained fixed on those 2 cups visible through the kitchen doorway, and after a moment she rose with apparent purpose. "I believe I shall fetch my gloves. I seem to have left them near the serving table." This was not strictly accurate, as her gloves were safely in her handbag, but it served as adequate excuse for approaching the kitchen entrance. The rope barrier hung at chest height, easily observed over or under for someone of Miss Marple's modest stature. The 2 cups sat side by side on the wooden draining board, their contents long since cold. Miss Marple studied them with the attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. Both had been used for tea, that much was evident, but the patterns of liquid within told distinctly different stories. The cup on the left showed a peculiar marking around its interior rim. The tea stain there was paler than the liquid below, with lighter eddies visible where milk had been added after the tea had already steeped. This created a subtle but distinctive pattern that any practiced tea drinker would recognize. Tea poured first, milk added second. The cup on the right presented an entirely different appearance. Here the stain was darker at the interior rim, the result of tea being poured into milk already present in the cup. Tea mixing created a different distribution of color, with the deeper tones settling at the edges where the liquid had sat longest. Miss Marple's memory, well trained through decades of village observation, supplied the relevant detail. Mr. Hartley had been most particular about his preference. "After," he had said curtly to Mrs. Reeve, "always after. The milk must come after the tea, not before." He had been quite emphatic. Yet here sat 2 cups from his final round of tasting, and one of them clearly showed the milk-first method he so deplored. More significantly, Miss Marple recalled his notation in that leather book, overdrawn. "Milk first," he had muttered, his pen scratching across the page with obvious disapproval. The comment had been made after tasting the 2nd cup, the one Mrs. March had brought fresh from the kitchen. Mrs. Reeve emerged from the vestry at that moment, her formidable composure somewhat restored, though her face remained flushed with indignation. "The inspector seems to think I may have been negligent in supervising the equipment, as though I have time to personally inspect every hinge and bracket in the parish hall." "That is precisely why we employ Pike." "Most vexing for you," Miss Marple agreed, "and after you had taken such care with your house blend." 3 months of preparation, I believe you mentioned. Mrs. Reeves' flush deepened indeed. Though I must say Mr. Hartley's palate was not as refined as his reputation suggested to claim my blend was overdrawn when it had steeped for precisely 4 minutes. And as for the milk-first accusation, I can assure you I poured his cup exactly as he specified. I'm certain you did, Miss Marple said soothingly, though I wonder, did you pour both cups Mr. Hartley tasted this afternoon? Both cups? Mrs. Reeve looked momentarily confused. No, only the first. Mrs. March insisted on fetching the second herself. Something about wanting to ensure it was at optimal temperature. She seemed quite anxious to please him. How thoughtful of her. Miss Marple glanced again at the 2 cups. And Mrs. March, I recall from conversation at the post office some weeks ago, mentioned being raised with the milk-first habit. Her mother apparently swore by it for preventing cracked china. Did she indeed? Mrs. Reeves' eyes narrowed slightly. How interesting. Mr. Hartley was quite clear in his notebook that the second cup showed milk-first preparation. I saw him write it down. Miss Marple nodded slowly, the pieces arranging themselves with increasing clarity. A woman anxious for approval, desperate for a favorable judgment. A lifetime habit of milk first, so ingrained as to be automatic when attention wandered, and a tea buyer whose notation would record that damning detail for posterity. The Reverend Clement appeared in the doorway leading from the church proper, his expression troubled. Inspector Slack wishes to know if anyone observed Mrs. March in the kitchen before the incident. Apparently, there's some question about the timing. She brought Mr. Hartley his second cup, Mrs. Reeve said firmly. I saw her take it through the hatch. That would have been perhaps 5 minutes before the accident, no more. And before that, the Reverend inquired gently. Mrs. Reeve frowned in concentration. She was hovering near the urns for some time. I recall nervous energy once supposed. Then she disappeared into the kitchen through the main door rather than using the hatch. Pike mentioned something about checking whether the water needed replenishing. Pike himself materialized as though summoned by the mention of his name. His thin face was drawn with anxiety, and his hands moved constantly, adjusting his collar and smoothing his jacket. I was in the store cupboard looking for a spare fuse, he said, addressing no one in particular. The circuits were running heavy with all the urns, and I wanted to be prepared in case of overload. Very prudent, Miss Marple murmured, though her attention had shifted to a new detail. On the windowsill beyond the draining board, among the various tea-making implements, sat a collection of canisters and tins. One labeled in careful script as Assam caught her eye particularly. Through the kitchen doorway at this angle, she could just make out that the tin's lid sat slightly askew as though it had been recently opened and imperfectly replaced. Hartley had expressed a preference for an Assam over smoky blends. She recalled he had mentioned it while examining Mrs. Reeves' offerings. Too much lapsang in this mix, he had said critically. I prefer a straightforward Assam. Had someone prepared a special cup to his specifications drawn from that tin? And if so, had the contents matched the label? I believe I shall retrieve those gloves after all, Miss Marple announced, though in truth her gloves remained precisely where they had been all along. What she truly sought was a clearer view of those tea tins and the story they might tell about hasty preparations and careful deceptions. The afternoon light was fading now, turning the parish hall golden and melancholy. Somewhere beyond these walls, Mr. Hartley lay unconscious in the cottage hospital, his leather notebook with its damning observations silent beside his bed. But here, among the cups and tins and trolleys, the evidence spoke in its own quiet language to those who knew how to listen. Chapter 5: The Kettle That Shrieked. The following morning brought with it the particular quality of light that April reserves for days after disturbance. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night turning over the events in her mind, arrived at the parish hall to find Inspector Slack already present, examining the kitchen with a methodical attention of one who suspects his initial assessment may have been incomplete. Dr. Haydock? had telephoned earlier with news from the cottage hospital. Mr. Hartley remained unconscious but stable, his condition neither improving nor deteriorating in any marked fashion. A tiny object tumbled out and landed with a faint click against the porcelain. It was round, no larger than a dried pea, with a small aperture through its center. The surface was damp and slightly corroded from its immersion, but the shape was unmistakable. "What the devil is that?" Slack leaned in for a closer look. "Unless I am very much mistaken, it is the insert from a child's toy whistle. You know the sort, the small metal whistles sold at fairs, with a pea inside that rattle Chapter 4. 2 cups, 1 habit." Inspector Slack had commandeered the small vestry room adjacent to the hall for his interviews, and the procession of witnesses filing in and out lent the afternoon an air of grim bureaucracy quite at odds with the Women's Institute's original intentions. Miss Marple, having given her own brief statement concerning the scream and its aftermath, found herself at liberty to observe the general disarray. The kitchen remained closed. A length of rope stretched across the doorway in lieu of proper police tape. Through the opening, Miss Marple could see the draining board where 2 teacups still sat awaiting attention. They had been pushed aside in the emergency, forgotten in the more pressing concern for Mr. Hartley's welfare, but they had not been washed. Lady Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's elbow, slightly breathless from her organizational efforts. "Well, Jane, what to do? Half the committee wants to cancel the remainder of the event, and the other half insists we must carry on in Mr. Hartley's honor. Though what honor there is in serving tea after a man's been struck down beside the trolley, I cannot fathom." "People do cling to routine in times of distress," Miss Marple observed. "It provides a sense of normality when events become abnormal." "I suppose so." Dolly lowered her voice. "Inspector Slack seems to think it was a straightforward accident. Faulty equipment, unfortunate timing, that sort of thing. Pike is beside himself naturally. Keeps insisting he checked everything this morning." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound. Her gaze remained fixed on those 2 cups visible through the kitchen doorway, and after a moment, she rose with apparent purpose. "I believe I shall fetch my gloves. I seem to have left them near the serving table." This was not strictly accurate, as her gloves were safely in her handbag, but it served as adequate excuse for approaching the kitchen entrance. The rope barrier hung at chest height, easily observed over or under for someone of Miss Marple's modest stature. The 2 cups sat side by side on the wooden draining board, their contents long since cold. Miss Marple studied them with the attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. Both had been used for tea. That much was evident, but the patterns of liquid within told distinctly different stories. The cup on the left showed a peculiar marking around its interior rim. The tea stain there was paler than the liquid below, with lighter eddies visible where milk had been added after the tea had already steeped. This created a subtle but distinctive pattern that any practiced tea drinker would recognize. Tea poured first, milk added second. The cup on the right presented an entirely different appearance. Here, the stain was darker at the interior rim, the result of tea being poured into milk already present in the cup. Tea mixing created a different distribution of color, with the deeper tones settling at the edges where the liquid had sat longest. Miss Marple's memory, well trained through decades of village observation, supplied the relevant detail. Mr. Hartley had been most particular about his preference. "After," he had said curtly to Mrs. Reeve, "always after. The milk must come after the tea, not before." He had been quite emphatic. Yet here sat 2 cups from his final round of tasting, and one of them clearly showed the milk first method he so deplored. More significantly, Miss Marple recalled his notation in that leather book, overdrawn. "Milk first," he had muttered, his pen scratching across the page with obvious disapproval. The comment had been made after tasting the second cup, the one Mrs. March had brought fresh from the kitchen. Mrs. Reeve emerged from the vestry at that moment, her formidable composure somewhat restored. though her face remained flushed with indignation. The inspector seems to think I may have been negligent in supervising the equipment, as though I have time to personally inspect every hinge and bracket in the parish hall. That is precisely why we employ Pike. Most vexing for you, Miss Marple agreed, and after you had taken such care with your house blend. 3 months of preparation, I believe you mentioned. Mrs. Reeves' flush deepened indeed. Though I must say Mr. Hartley's palate was not as refined as his reputation suggested, to claim my blend was overdrawn when it had steeped for precisely 4 minutes. And as for the milk first accusation, I can assure you I poured his cup exactly as he specified. I'm certain you did, Miss Marple said soothingly. Though I wonder, did you pour both cups Mr. Hartley tasted this afternoon? Both cups? Mrs. Reeve looked momentarily confused. No, only the first. Mrs. March insisted on fetching the second herself. Something about wanting to ensure it was at optimal temperature. She seemed quite anxious to please him. How thoughtful of her. Miss Marple glanced again at the 2 cups. And Mrs. March, I recall from conversation at the post office some weeks ago, mentioned being raised with the milk first habit. Her mother apparently swore by it for preventing cracked china. Did she indeed? Mrs. Reeves' eyes narrowed slightly. How interesting. Mr. Hartley was quite clear in his notebook that the second cup showed milk first preparation. I saw him write it down. Miss Marple nodded slowly, the pieces arranging themselves with increasing clarity. A woman anxious for approval, desperate for a favorable judgment. A lifetime habit of milk first, so ingrained as to be automatic when attention wandered. And a tea buyer whose notation would record that damning detail for posterity. The Reverend Clement appeared in the doorway leading from the church proper, his expression troubled. Inspector Slack wishes to know if anyone observed Mrs. March in the kitchen before the incident. Apparently there's some question about the timing. She brought Mr. Hartley his second cup, Mrs. Reeves said firmly. I saw her take it through the hatch. That would have been perhaps 5 minutes before the accident, no more. And before that, the Reverend inquired gently. Mrs. Reeve frowned in concentration. She was hovering near the urns for some time. I recall nervous energy once supposed. Then she disappeared into the kitchen through the main door rather than using the hatch. Pike mentioned something about checking whether the water needed replenishing. Pike himself materialized as though summoned by the mention of his name. His thin face was drawn with anxiety and his hands moved constantly, adjusting his collar and smoothing his jacket. I was in the store cupboard looking for a spare fuse, he said, addressing no one in particular. The circuits were running heavy with all the urns, and I wanted to be prepared in case of overload. Very prudent, Miss Marple murmured, though her attention had shifted to a new detail. On the windowsill beyond the draining board, among the various tea-making implements, sat a collection of canisters and tins. One labeled in careful script as Assam caught her eye particularly. Through the kitchen doorway at this angle, she could just make out that the tin's lid sat slightly askew as though it had been recently opened and imperfectly replaced. Mr. Hartley had expressed a preference for an Assam over smoky blends. She recalled he had mentioned it while examining Mrs. Reeves' offerings. Too much lapsang in this mix, he had said critically. I prefer a straightforward Assam. Had someone prepared a special cup to his specifications drawn from that tin? And if so, had the contents matched the label? I believe I shall retrieve those gloves after all, Miss Marple announced. Though in truth her gloves remained precisely where they had been all along. What she truly sought was a clearer view of those tea tins, and the story they might tell about hasty preparations and careful deceptions. The afternoon light was fading now, turning the parish hall golden and melancholy. Somewhere beyond these walls, Mr. Hartley lay unconscious in the cottage hospital, his leather notebook with its damning observations silent beside his bed. But here, among the cups and tins and trolleys, the evidence spoke in its own quiet language to those who knew how to listen. Chapter 5: The Kettle That Shrieked. The following morning brought with it the particular quality of light that April reserves for days after disturbance. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night turning over the events in her mind, arrived at the parish hall to find Inspector Slack already present. Examining the kitchen with a methodical attention of one who suspects his initial assessment may have been incomplete, Dr. Haydock had telephoned earlier with news from the cottage hospital. Mr. Hartley remained unconscious but stable, his condition neither improving nor deteriorating in any marked fashion, is to create the sound. Miss Marple rolled the tiny sphere gently on the saucer. If one were to place such an object in a kettle spout, steam pressure would force it to vibrate and produce a sound remarkably like a scream, for a moment or two at least until it dislodged and fell silent. Slack's expression had transformed from puzzlement to sharp attention. "You're saying someone put this in the kettle deliberately to create that scream?" "I am suggesting it as a possibility, though for what purpose?" "I cannot immediately say." The inspector seized the kettle and examined the spout himself, his jaw set in a hard line. But why? What would be the point of making a kettle scream when it shouldn't? Miss Marple returned to the doorway and looked out into the hall, reconstructing the scene in her mind. "Consider the timing, Inspector." The scream occurred at precisely the moment someone needed attention drawn away from the kitchen. Everyone turned towards the sound, then rushed towards its source. In that brief interval of confusion, something else happened, something that required witnesses to be distracted. "The trolley," Slack said slowly, "the stay coming loose or being made to appear as though it had come loose." Slack's face darkened. "You're suggesting this was deliberate, that someone arranged for that trolley arm to strike Hartley." "I am suggesting that a great many curious things have occurred, Inspector, each of which might be explained away individually, but which together form a pattern that seems rather too convenient to be entirely accidental." She moved back to the windowsill, where the spirit lamp sat among the tea-making supplies. Pike had mentioned using it to keep a second pot warm, standard practice for extended service. The lamp was of the old-fashioned variety, with a reservoir of methylated spirits and a cotton wick that could be adjusted for flame height. Miss Marple bent closer, her sharp eyes noting the fresh brown scorch mark along the tin casing. The discoloration was recent, darker at the edges where heat had concentrated. She touched it lightly with one finger and felt the rough texture of carbon deposit. "This lamp was lit yesterday," she observed. "One can still smell the spirits faintly. And here this mark suggests something rested against the flame for a brief period, something that charred rather than melted." "Cotton," Slack said, following her reasoning. "Like a wick but heavier gauge. Or perhaps like thread." Miss Marple suggested the sort one might use to secure something temporarily. "Thread burns rather than melts. You see, it produces char and ash, particularly if it's been treated with starch or sizing." She straightened, her expression thoughtful. "If one wished to create a delay, a thread led across a small flame would serve admirably. The heat would weaken the fibers gradually until they parted. The timing would be imprecise certainly, but predictable within a range of seconds, perhaps a minute or two, depending on the thread's thickness and the flame's intensity." Slack pulled out his notebook with decisive motions. "You're painting a picture of deliberate planning, Miss Marple. A whistle pea for distraction, a thread for timing, and a trolley rigged to strike when the thread burned through." "I am merely observing what the objects themselves suggest, Inspector. The interpretation must be your province, not mine. This changes everything." Slack stared at the kettle with new understanding. This wasn't an accident at all. Someone tried to kill Peril Hartley, or at minimum to injure him severely enough to prevent him from completing his duties. Miss Marple's fingers found the edge of her handbag, where her handkerchief still carried the faint scent of theatrical glycerin. The question becomes not whether this was deliberate, but rather who possessed both the means and the motive to execute such an elaborate scheme. Through the window, St. Mary Mead went about its morning business in apparent innocence. But here in the parish hall kitchen, among kettles and spirit lamps and folding trolleys, The evidence of calculated violence lay scattered like breadcrumbs on a path that Miss Marple was beginning to follow with increasing certainty towards its inevitable conclusion. Chapter 6. Athred charred at the hinge. Inspector Slack's transformation from skeptical investigator of an accident to determined pursuer of a criminal was both swift and thorough. Within the hour, he had summoned Pike to provide a detailed demonstration of the trolley's mechanism, and the caretaker now stood before the apparatus with the anxious expression of one whose professional competence has been called into question. "Show me exactly how this trolley operates," Slack commanded. "From folded to fully open, if you please." Pike, his hands trembling slightly, grasped the main frame and began the process. The trolley was a clever piece of engineering, Miss Marple observed, designed to fold flat for storage and open into a serviceable serving station. The hinge tray arm was the crucial element, swinging outward on a well-oiled pivot to create a horizontal surface at convenient height. "The stay catches here," Pike explained, his voice tight with nervous precision. He indicated a small metal bracket at the hinge point. When the arm reaches the proper angle, this notched piece slides into position and holds everything firm. It's a simple mechanism, but effective. I've maintained dozens like it over the years. And you checked this particular stay yesterday morning. First thing, Inspector? I oiled the hinge and tested the catch 3 times. It held perfectly. Slack bent closer, examining the hinge assembly with minute attention. Miss Marple, standing at a discreet distance, watched his face change as his fingers discovered something among the metal fittings. "Miss Marple," he said slowly, "you might want to see this." She approached with measured steps. Slack was holding a pair of tweezers, and between their tips dangled a fragment so small as to be nearly invisible. It was dark, brittle, no more than a 1/4 inch in length. "Caught in the hinge mechanism," Slack said, "right where the stay should have engaged." Miss Marple produced her spectacles from her handbag and leaned in to examine the fragment. It was unmistakably thread, heavily charred at one end where fire had consumed it. The other end showed signs of having been pulled or torn, the fiber separated by force rather than cut cleanly. "Cotton thread," she observed, "medium weight, the sort used for general sewing, and burnt through as we hypothesized." Pike stared at the fragment as though it were a serpent. "But how did thread get into my trolley mechanism? I cleaned that hinge myself yesterday morning. There was nothing there but a bit of dust." "Precisely," Miss Marple said gently. "Which suggests it was placed there after your morning inspection, Mr. Pike. Placed deliberately and for a specific purpose." Slack was already reconstructing the scene with the focused intensity of one who has glimpsed the underlying pattern. The thread was attached to the stay somehow. When it burned through, the stay came loose and the arm swung free. The weight of the arm itself did the rest. But where was the other end? Pike's bewilderment was genuine. Thread doesn't burn itself. Something had to set its light. Miss Marple gestured towards the windowsill. "The spirit lamp. I believe if one end of the thread was secured to the trolley stay and the other positioned above the lamp's flame, the heat would gradually weaken the fibers. When they parted, the stay would slip free." She moved to the trolley and studied its position relative to the windowsill. The distance was perhaps 2 ft, easily spanned by a length of thread. The spirit lamp sat at precisely the right height to create an unobtrusive connection. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, and at Slack's nod, she carefully opened the trolley to its full extension, setting the stay, as per demonstrated. Then, with delicate precision, she took a length of thread from her own sewing kit and demonstrated how it might have been arranged. One end looped through the stay's notch. The thread led across the intervening space, passing just above the spirit lamp's wick. No knots, nothing elaborate, simply positioned so that flame and fiber would inevitably meet. "Like the lamp and the countdown begins," Slack muttered. "Clever, diabolically clever." "And imprecise," Miss Marple added. The timing would vary depending on the thread's exact placement and the flame's height. But for someone who simply needed a delay of a minute or two, it would serve adequately. Pike had gone quite pale. "You're saying someone rigged my trolley to attack Mr. Hartley? But who would do such a thing, and when?" "The kitchen was never empty yesterday afternoon." "Not entirely empty, perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "but certainly busy enough that someone moving about the tea-making supplies would attract little notice." Everyone was preoccupied with the judging, after all. Slack made several sharp notations in his book, The Spirit Lamp. Who had access to it yesterday? "I lit it myself," Pike admitted. "Mrs. Reeve wanted the second pot kept warm, so I set it up on the sill around 3 Lau. Standard procedure for extended service." And after that, Pike's brow furrowed with concentration. "It burned throughout the afternoon. I checked it once or twice to ensure the wick wasn't smoking." Mrs. March was near the sill at one point, rearranging the tea tins for better presentation, and Miss Cribb was fetching cups from the shelf above, but neither of them seemed to pay any attention to the lamp itself. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Mrs. March was rearranging the tea tins. "When was this?" "Perhaps 20 minutes before the accident. I remember because she seemed quite agitated, moving things about with rather more energy than necessary. I asked if she needed assistance, but she said she was merely tidying." "Tidying?" Miss Marple repeated softly. The word hung in the air with peculiar weight. She returned her attention to the spirit lamp, examining the brown scorch mark on its tin casing more closely. The discoloration formed a distinct line, as though something had rested against the hot metal for several seconds, not the thread itself, which would have burned too quickly. Something else. Perhaps the thread had been held taut by some arrangement, pressed against the lamp's side to ensure consistent contact with the heat. The positioning would require care, she mused aloud. The thread must be close enough to the flame to burn, but not so close as to ignite immediately. A delayed action carefully calculated. Calculated by someone familiar with the kitchen layout, Slack added grimly. Someone who knew where the trolley would stand, where the lamp would be, and how to connect the two without drawing attention. Pike wrung his hands. Mr. Hartley was standing just there when it happened beside the trolley. If the arm swung free suddenly, it would catch Haim at exactly the right height, temple level, as Dr. Haydock said. The three of them stood in silence, contemplating the vicious simplicity of the mechanism. A thread, a flame, a weighted arm. Common objects transformed into instruments of violence through nothing more than careful arrangement and timing. "The whistle pea in the kettle served as the signal," Miss Marple said, piecing together the sequence. When the thread was nearly burned through, the kettle would begin to shriek. Everyone's attention would turn towards the sound. In that moment of distraction, the thread would part, the stay would slip, and the arm would swing. Mr. Partly, drawn by the commotion like everyone else, would be in precisely the wrong place. Or precisely the right place from the attacker's perspective, Slack said darkly. He closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "This wasn't opportunistic, Miss Marple. This was planned, carefully, methodically planned, by someone who understood both the equipment and the victim's likely position." Miss Marple folded her hands over her handbag, her expression grave. "Indeed, Inspector, and planned, I suspect, by someone who had a very pressing reason to prevent Mr. Hartley from completing his assessment and recording his final judgments." The morning sun had climbed higher, filling the kitchen with light that seemed almost cruel in its clarity. Every surface, every object stood revealed in sharp detail, including, Miss Marple thought, the path that led inexorably towards a conclusion she had been reluctant to reach, but could no longer reasonably avoid. Chapter 7, Sugar Book and Alibis. By midday, Inspector Slack had assembled the principal witnesses in the parish hall proper, the kitchen remaining cordoned for further examination. The afternoon had taken on the quality of a formal inquest, though Mr. Hartley's continued unconsciousness meant that certain questions must remain for the moment unanswered. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the window once more, her knitting progressing with steady rhythm, while her attention remained wholly focused on the proceedings. Lady Bantry sat beside her, maintaining a silence that spoke of long friendship and mutual understanding. Mrs. Reeve was the first to be recalled, her formidable bearing intact, despite the obvious strain of the situation. She stood before Inspector Slack with the dignity of one accustomed to command, though her fingers betrayed her by twisting the strap of her handbag. "Mrs. Reeve, I need to establish everyone's precise location at the time of the incident," Slack began. "You were at the front of the hall, I believe." "I was conducting the raffle draw," Mrs. Reeve replied firmly, from 3:40 until the scream interrupted. "I had just called number 47 when that dreadful sound occurred. Mrs. Bantry can confirm it. She was seated at the second table and had just checked her ticket." Dolly nodded. "Quite right, Inspector. I remember being disappointed that my number hadn't come up yet. Mrs. Reeve was very much occupied with the proceedings, and you remained at your post throughout. Naturally, the raffle is a serious responsibility. One cannot simply abandon one's duties because of kitchen clatter, though of course the scream proved to be rather more than ordinary clatter." Slack made his notation and turned to Pike, who had been hovering near the door with the anxious air of a man expecting further accusations. "Mr. Pike, your whereabouts between 3 and the incident?" Pike's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "The store cupboard, Inspector. I went to fetch a spare fuse box. With all the urns running simultaneously, I was concerned about circuit overload. The wiring in these old buildings can be temperamental. Can anyone verify this?" "I'm afraid not. The cupboard is at the end of the corridor beyond the vestry, but I was there, I assure you. I found the fuse box and was returning when I heard the commotion." "How convenient," Slack observed dryly. "And Miss Cribb?" Sylvia stepped forward with a theatrical flutter that seemed under the circumstances somewhat misplaced. Her scarf had been rearranged since the previous day, now draped with studied casualness over one shoulder. "I was at the serving station replacing cups on the high shelf, the upper cupboard, you understand. Mrs. Reeve had requested that we display the complete set of Paris china, and some pieces have been stored away. I was fetching them down and arranging them properly. This would have required you to stand on something, presumably." "The small step stool?" "It lives in the corner by the hatch." Sylvia's hands moved expressively as she spoke. "I had my back to the kitchen door, focused entirely on not dropping the coal port. Frightfully valuable, you know. When the scream came, I nearly fell off the stool in shock." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. The high shelf, she thought, a position that would provide an excellent view of the kitchen interior, should one choose to glance over one shoulder. Yet Miss Cribb claimed to have noticed nothing unusual, and Mrs. March Slackstone had sharpened perceptibly. Where was she during this crucial period? A heavy silence settled over the hall. Mrs. March, seated at a table near the back, had been weeping quietly throughout the interviews. Now she looked up, her face ravaged by tears. Both real and theatrical, though Miss Marple suspected the former now predominated. "I was moving between the hatch and the urns," Mrs. March said in a voice barely above a whisper, "trying to be useful, trying to ensure everything was perfect for the judging." "Rather vague, Mrs. March. Can you be more specific?" "I brought Mr. Hartley his second cup. That was perhaps 10 minutes before the accident. Then I tidied the tea tins on the windowsill, as Mr. Pike mentioned. After that, I believe I was at the urn checking the water levels." "You believe?" Mrs. March's hands twisted in her lap. He was in a state of considerable anxiety. Inspector Mr. Hartley had been so critical of my tea room's offerings. His assessment could make or break my business. I'm afraid my attention was rather scattered. Slack consulted his notes with deliberate slowness. "I've been making inquiries about your tea room, Mrs. March, specifically about your supply arrangements." The color drained from Mrs. March's already pale face. "There's a matter of some discrepancy," Slack continued. "Your sugar purchases, according to the wholesale records, don't align with your reported sales. The amounts are significantly short. A gasp rippled through the assembled witnesses. Miss Marple watched Mrs. March's reaction with the clinical interest of a naturalist observing a specimen under glass. "I can explain," Mrs. March began, then faltered. "That is, there have been some accounting errors. My bookkeeping has been rather haphazard. Haphazard enough that Mr. Hartley's firm had begun asking questions." Slack produced a folded letter from his pocket. "I found this among Mr. Hartley's effects at his lodgings. A memo from his head office requesting he investigate certain irregularities in local tea establishments. Your name features prominently, Mrs. March." Mrs. March seemed to collapse inward, her shoulders bowing under an invisible weight. "He told me he would be reviewing my records. Said that his assessment wouldn't be limited to the quality of my tea, but would encompass the entirety of my business practices." I knew what he would find. The shortages, the substitutions in the tea blends, the inferior leaves sold as premium stock. A compelling motive, Slack observed quietly, for preventing Mr. Hartley from completing his investigation. "No," the word emerged as a sob. "No, I would never." An accident. Surely it was merely an accident. But her protest carried little conviction, and the assembled company exchanged glances heavy with significance. Miss Marple's needles had resumed their steady rhythm, though her eyes never left Mrs. March's crumbling composure. The alibis had been established, each person's position carefully noted. Mrs. Reeve at the front, calling numbers with witnesses to confirm. Pike in the distant store cupboard, conveniently alone. Miss Cribb on her step-stool back turned to the crucial scene, and Mrs. March floating between stations near the tea tins and the spirit lamp with both motive and opportunity to arrange a tragic accident that was anything but accidental. Yet something nagged at Miss Marple's consciousness. Some detail that didn't quite align, some thread that remained unconnected. She thought of the milk-first habit so deeply ingrained. The glycerin tears borrowed from a friend's theatrical supplies, the whistle pea that required knowledge of such things. The pieces were assembling, but the picture they formed was not yet complete. One or two elements remained obscured, waiting for the proper light to reveal their true significance. Outside, clouds had begun to gather over St. Mary Mead, lending the afternoon a brooding quality that matched the mood within the hall. Somewhere in the cottage hospital, Mr. Hartley's fate hung in the balance. And here, among the abandoned teacups and the carefully recorded alibis, truth struggled to emerge from the shadows of deception. Chapter 8. The Tea Tin with the Wrong Leaf. The afternoon had worn on with a peculiar exhaustion that follows revelation and accusation. Inspector Slack had dismissed the assembled witnesses with instructions to remain available for further questioning, though his attention clearly remained fixed upon Mrs. March as the most probable architect of the morning's violence. Miss Marple, however, had requested permission to examine the kitchen once more before departing. Slack, perhaps recognizing the value of her observations thus far, granted the request with only minimal grumbling about interference with official investigations. 5 minutes, Miss Marple, and touch nothing without informing me first. Naturally, Inspector, I merely wish to satisfy myself on one or two small points. Lady Bantry accompanied her, curiosity having thoroughly overtaken any inclination to return home. What are you looking for, Jane? It seems quite clear that poor Mrs. March, desperate as she was, arranged that dreadful mechanism. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, her tone suggesting reservations, though I find myself troubled by certain inconsistencies. She moved to the windowsill where the tea supplies had been arranged for the previous day's service. The spirit lamp remained in position, cold now and thoroughly examined. Beside it stood the collection of tins and canisters that contained various tea blends, each labeled in Mrs. Reeve's precise hand. Miss Marple's attention focused on one tin in particular. The label read Assam in careful capitals, the sort of strong malty tea that Mr. Hartley had expressed preference for during his tastings. The lid, as she had noted yesterday, sat slightly askew. "Inspector," she called softly. "Might I open this tin?" Slack approached, his expression wary. "What of it? I should like to verify its contents." With Slack's nod of permission, Miss Marple lifted the lid. The scent that emerged was immediately wrong. Instead of the robust, earthy aroma characteristic of an Assam tea, a lighter, more floral fragrance rose from within. Miss Marple withdrew a small quantity of the leaf and examined it in her palm. The leaves were pale, golden brown, delicate, and tightly rolled. Nothing like the broad, dark leaves of proper Assam. "Lapsang," she announced, "or possibly a blended tea with significant Lapsang content. Certainly not an Assam." Mrs. Reeve, who had lingered near the doorway despite being dismissed, made a small sound of distress. "Oh dear, that's my fault, I'm afraid. I rearranged the tins on Thursday evening, wanting them to look presentable for the judging. I must have mixed up the labels." Her face had flushed a deep crimson, the color of genuine embarrassment. How mortifying. Mr. Hartley specifically asked about an Assam content, and I directed him to the wrong tin entirely. "An honest mistake," Miss Marple said gently, though her mind was working rapidly through the implications. She returned the tea toits mislabeled home and replaced the lid with care. "But don't you see what this means?" Dolly's voice carried excitement. If the wrong tea was in the tin and Mrs. March prepared a cup from it, Mr. Hartley would have known immediately. His palate was supposedly quite refined indeed. Miss Marple moved to the draining board where the two cups still sat in their positions of silent testimony. Mr. Hartley's notation in his book was quite specific. Overdrawn, milk first, two distinct criticisms of a single cup of tea. She studied the cups once more, noting again the telltale patterns of their preparation. One showed tea, then milk, Mr. Hartley's preferred method. The other displayed milk first, the method he had explicitly condemned. "Mrs. Reeve, you poured the first cup for Mr. Hartley, did you not?" "I did. Tea first, then milk, exactly as he specified. I took particular care with it, given his reputation for exacting standards." "And the second cup was fetched by Mrs. March from the kitchen." Mrs. Reeve nodded. "She was most insistent about bringing it herself. Said something about ensuring proper temperature." Miss Marple's fingers traced the rim of the milk first cup without quite touching it. "Mrs. March, as I recalled from a conversation at the post office, was raised with the milk first habit. Her mother considered it essential for preventing cracked china." "Old-fashioned nonsense," Mrs. Reeve muttered. "Proper tea service requires tea first always." "Quite so. Yet habits formed in childhood run deep, particularly when one's attention is divided by stress or anxiety." Miss Marple straightened her expression thoughtful. "Imagine, if you will, Mrs. March in this kitchen, desperate for Mr. Hartley's approval. Knowing her business hangs in the balance, she prepares his tea. But in her agitated state, she reverts to the habit of a lifetime. Milk first, before she quite realizes what she's done. And then Mr. Hartley tastes it," Dolly breathed, following the logic. "He knows immediately that milk went in first. He makes his damning notation. Worse still," Miss Marple continued, "the tea itself is wrong. Mrs. March, directed to the Assampton by Mrs. Reeves, well-intentioned but inaccurate labeling, has brewed Lapsang Aura Light blend when Mr. Hartley expected the robust character of an Assam. The flavor would be noticeably different. Weaker, perhaps, overdrawn, as he noted, because Mrs. March likely steeped it longer, trying to achieve depth it could never possess." Inspector Slack had been following this reconstruction with increasing attention. So she serves him a cup that reveals both her careless preparation and inferior knowledge of tea. For a woman hoping to establish her tea room's reputation, this would be disastrous, particularly, Miss Marple added quietly, when combined with the impending discovery of her fraudulent bookkeeping. Mr. Hartley would return to Reading with a thoroughly damning report. The poor quality tea, the milk first preparation, suggesting ignorance of proper service, and the sugar discrepancies suggesting dishonesty. Mrs. March's tea room would be finished before it had properly begun. The kitchen fell silent, save for the ticking of the hall clock beyond the doorway. Through the window, Miss Marple could see the churchyard, where spring flowers bloomed in cheerful defiance of the day's grim proceedings. Motive enough for murder, Slack said flatly, or attempted murder at any rate. She had the means, the opportunity, and now we've established the motive beyond any reasonable doubt. Yet Miss Marple found herself hesitating, her mind returning to those small inconsistencies that had troubled her earlier. The glycerin tears borrowed from Miss Cribb's theatrical supplies, the whistle pea requiring knowledge of such mechanisms, the precise arrangement of thread and flame. "Inspector," she said slowly, "might I ask whether Mrs. March has any background in theatrical work or in mechanical contrivances?" Slack consulted his notes. "None that I'm aware of. She worked as a shop assistant before opening the tea room. No dramatic experience mentioned in any of my inquiries. And yet the method employed required both theatrical knowledge and mechanical ingenuity. The glycerin for false tears, the whistle pea for the kettle, the thread and flame timing device. Each element suggests a mind comfortable with stagecraft and practical mechanics." "She could have learned such things," Slack protested, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "She could have," Miss Marple agreed, "though it seems rather elaborate for someone in such desperate straits." Desperate people tend toward simple, immediate solutions. This crime showed planning, creativity, and a certain theatrical flair. She moved to the center of the kitchen, turning slowly to take in the entire scene. The teas with their mixed labels, the spirit lamp with its brown scorch mark, the folding trolley with its deadly arm, and throughout it all, that nagging sense of something not quite right, like a stitch dropped in an otherwise perfect piece of knitting. "I believe," Miss Marple said at last, "that we must look more carefully at exactly who possessed the knowledge, the skill, and the temperament to execute such an elaborate scheme. Mrs. March had motive, certainly, but motive alone does not make a murderer. We must also consider means and opportunity in their fullest sense." She paused, her gaze distant, "and we must ask ourselves why someone with theatrical connections and intimate knowledge of this kitchen's layout might have reason to assist in such a crime, or to execute it themselves, while allowing suspicion to fall elsewhere. The implications hung heavy in the air, waiting for someone brave enough to grasp them." Chapter 9. The Trolley That Folded Itself. Evening had settled over St. Mary Mead. By the time Miss Marple returned to the parish hall, this time accompanied by both Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock, the doctor had arrived with news from the cottage hospital. Mr. Hartley had regained consciousness, though he remained confused and unable to provide any coherent account of the incident. His memory of the crucial moments appeared to have been erased by the blow. "He remembers tasting tea," Haddock reported. "Remembers being critical of the preparation. But the scream and what followed gone entirely, not uncommon with head trauma of this severity." Slack had grudgingly agreed to Miss Marple's request for a final examination of the evidence, though his patience was wearing thin. "I don't see what more there is to discover, Miss Marple." Mrs. March had motive, opportunity, and was seen near the relevant equipment. "The case seems clear enough. Humor me for just a few moments longer, Inspector." Miss Marple had brought her knitting bag, from which she now withdrew a length of ordinary cotton thread. "I should like to demonstrate something." Pike had been summoned once again to assist with the trolley, and he now stood beside it with the weary resignation of one who has repeated the same actions too many times. At Miss Marple's direction, he opened the trolley to its full extension and set the stay properly. "Now then," Miss Marple said, approaching the mechanism with careful deliberation. "Mr. Pike, you mentioned that the stay must be set just so for the arm to hold securely. Would you show us precisely what you mean?" Pike demonstrated, pressing the metal stay into its notch with a firm click. Like that. It takes a bit of pressure, but once it's seated, it's quite secure. The arm won't budge unless you deliberately release the stay. Thank you. And now, if I may, Miss Marple took the thread and looped on end loosely through the stay mechanism, being careful not to dislodge it. The thread led across the intervening space toward the windowsill, where the spirit lamp sat cold and innocent. She did not light the lamp. Instead, she simply positioned the thread so that it passed directly above where the flame would be, with perhaps an inch of clearance. The demonstration required no actual fire to illustrate its effectiveness. The thread is secured to the stay, she explained, her voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher with attentive pupils. When heat from the lamp weakens it sufficiently, the thread parts. The stay, no longer held in position by this additional constraint, slips from its notch. The heavy tray arm swings free. She let her hand trace the arc the arm would follow. A flat trajectory ending precisely at temple height for someone standing beside the trolley. Simple, Slack muttered. Effective and absolutely damning for Mrs. March. Indeed, it appears so. Miss Marple removed the thread carefully and returned it to her bag. Yet I find myself considering the precise timing required. The thread must be positioned after the lamp is lit, but before Mr. Hartley enters the kitchen. Too early and the thread burns through prematurely. Too late and there's insufficient time for the heat to weaken it. She moved to the windowsill, examining the arrangement of tins and equipment with minute attention. Mrs. March was seen tidying these tins approximately 20 minutes before the incident. The lamp was already burning as Mr. Pike had lit it earlier for the second pot. If Mrs. March arranged the thread at that time, she would need to ensure Mr. Hartley would be in the correct position 20 minutes hence. She served him his cup shortly after. Slack pointed out she could have encouraged him to return to the kitchen, perhaps suggesting something required his immediate attention. Possibly. Miss Marple's tone remained thoughtful, though Mr. Hartley does not strike me as the sort of man who would be easily directed by a nervous tea-room proprietor. He seemed rather to go where he pleased and when he pleased. Haydock had been observing the demonstration with interest. The whistle pea you found in the kettle? That would provide the signal as you suggested. Draw everyone's attention at the crucial moment. Yes, the whistle pea. Miss Marple returned to the kettle, lifting it once more. A child's toy, really. The sort of thing found in any theatrical property box alongside glycerin and grease paint. The emphasis was slight, but Slack caught it immediately. His expression shifted from certainty to reluctant doubt. Miss Cribb, he said slowly. You're suggesting Miss Cribb was involved. I am suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that we consider who possessed the knowledge to execute each element of this crime. The glycerin for false tears. Miss Cribb admitted quite freely to providing it. The whistle pea. A theatrical property, the elaborate mechanism of thread and flame, the sort of stage effect one might employ for dramatic timing. She sat down the kettle and turned to face the inspector directly. Moreover, Miss Cribb claimed to be on a step stool with her back turned during the crucial moments. Yet the high shelf where she was supposedly arranging china provides an excellent view of the kitchen interior. One would naturally glance down occasionally to ensure one's balance, particularly when handling valuable pieces. She could have seen the thread being arranged, Dolly breathed, understanding dawning. She could have seen whoever did it. Or she could have arranged it herself, Miss Marple said quietly. Consider her position. High enough to work unobserved by those in the hall, close enough to the windowsill to reach across and position the thread, and with a perfect excuse for being in that location, should anyone question her presence. Slack's face had darkened considerably. But what motive would Miss Cribb have? She barely knew Hartley. Her tea room wasn't being investigated. No, Miss Marple agreed. Her tea room was not being investigated. But Mrs. March's was, and Mrs. March, desperate and frightened, would make an excellent scapegoat for a crime committed by someone else. Someone with both the theatrical skill to execute it and the cunning to ensure suspicion fell elsewhere. She paused, allowing the implications to settle. I wonder, Inspector, whether you have inquired into Miss Cribb's financial circumstances or her relationship with Mrs. March beyond their apparent friendship. Slack pulled out his notebook with sharp, angry movements. I'll make inquiries immediately, though I still don't see what Miss Cribb gains from attacking Hartley. Perhaps nothing directly, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps something we have not yet discovered. But consider this. If Mrs. March were to be convicted of this crime, her tea room would close. The premises would become available. And who in St. Mary Mead has expressed theatrical ambitions that might benefit from owning a commercial space on the high street? The silence that followed was profound. Through the window, the last light of evening painted the churchyard in shades of amber and shadow. Inside the parish hall, among the tea-making equipment and the folding trolley, the truth was beginning to emerge from its careful concealment. The thread tells us how, Miss Marple said softly. The mislabeled tin and the milk first cup tell us why suspicion would fall on Mrs. March. But the glycerin, the whistle pea, and the theatrical timing tell us who possessed the skills to execute such an elaborate deception. She folded her hands over her knitting bag, her expression grave. Sometimes, Inspector, the person who provides comfort to the accused is the very person who has arranged for them toned comforting. A performance, if you will, with Mrs. March cast as the unwitting villain, and Miss Cribb as the sympathetic friend. All that was required was setting the stage properly and ensuring the audience looked in the right direction at the crucial moment. Slack closed his notebook, his jaw set in a hard line. I'll bring Miss Cribb in for questioning tonight, and this time I'll be asking rather different questions than before. As they filed out of the kitchen, Miss Marple cast one final glance at the trolley in the windowsill. The mechanism was simple enough, really. What made it effective was not its complexity, but its misdirection. Like all good theatrical effects, it drew the eye where the performer wished it to go, while the real work happened elsewhere, unnoticed and unremarked, until someone looked closely enough to see the strings. Chapter 10: Kitchen, Kettle, Tears, and a Timetable. The resolution came not with drama, but with the quiet accumulation of facts that could no longer be denied. Miss Cribb, confronted in Inspector Slack's makeshift interview room with the evidence of her theatrical supplies and the precise timeline of her movements, had maintained her composure for perhaps 20 minutes before the weight of observation became insurmountable. It was the discovery in her lodgings that proved decisive. Among her theatrical belongings, carefully stored in a wooden box beneath her bed, Inspector Slack found a spool of cotton thread that matched exactly the charred fragment from the trolley hinge. More damning still, a small envelope containing 3 additional whistle peas. They're twins, to the one recovered from the kettle. Miss Marple, permitted to observe the final interview by virtue of her contributions to the investigation, sat quietly in the corner as Miss Cribb's performance finally ended. It was meant to be simple, Miss Cribb said at last. Her dramatic bearing collapsed into something smaller and more human, just enough to prevent him from completing his assessment. I never intended to kill him. You must believe that. Only to injure him sufficiently that he would be taken away, unable to finish his damning report about Hilda's tea room. Why Slack's question was blunt. Why risk everything for Mrs. March's business? Miss Cribb's laugh held no humor. Because I needed that tea room, Inspector, the building, the location, everything about it. I've been trying to establish a proper theatrical venue in St. Mary Mead for 3 years. The parish hall is adequate for amateur productions, but I had grander visions. A salon, a gathering place for artistic expression. The tea room premises would have been perfect, positioned right on the high street. And Mrs. March would never sell to you, Miss Marple observed gently. No, she was too stubborn, too desperate to make her pathetic little enterprise succeed, despite having neither the skill nor the business sense required. Miss Cribb's voice had taken on a bitter edge. You offered her a fair price 6 months ago. She refused. Said it was her dream, her independence. So I watched her struggle, watched her cut corners and substitute inferior supplies. Watched her dig herself deeper into debt. Until Mr. Hartley's investigation provided an opportunity, Slack said grimly. Yes. The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. When I learned he was coming to judge the tea and investigate the local establishments, I saw my chance. If Hilda were exposed as a fraud, perhaps even arrested for her bookkeeping irregularities, the tea room would have to close, the property would become available, and I would finally have my venue. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the silence that followed. But exposure alone was insufficient. You needed something more dramatic, more immediate, something that would ensure Mr. Hartley could not complete his assessment, and that would cast such suspicion on Mrs. March that her guilt would seem inevitable. The trolley was my inspiration, Miss Cribb admitted. I'd helped Pike coil it the previous week for our dramatic society set construction. I understood how the mechanism worked, how the stay held the arm. The idea came to me fully formed like a stage direction in a script, a thread across the flame timed to part at the crucial moment. The whistle P to create the scream to draw attention, and provide the signal and Hilda's own desperation to serve as motive. The glycerin was a particularly clever touch, Miss Marple remarked, providing Mrs. March with the means to create false tears, then ensuring suspicion would fall upon those very tears. Miss Cribb's expression flickered with something that might have been pride. I told her it was for the newspaper photograph, that it would make her look more earnest and dedicated. She used it that very day for the picture. When it suggested she might apply just a touch before the judging, to show proper emotion about her tea room's prospects, she never suspected anything amiss. So when Mr. Hartley was struck down, she genuinely wept, Slack said. But with glycerin already applied, her tears looked false, theatrical, making her appear calculated and deceptive rather than genuinely distressed, Miss Marple added. A masterstroke of misdirection, Miss Cribb. You might have succeeded had you not underestimated the power of small observations. The interview concluded with Miss Cribb's formal arrest, charged with attempted murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. As she was led away, her theatrical bearing reasserted itself briefly, shoulders back and chin high, as though exiting stage left after a particularly demanding performance. Later, in the fading light of the parish hall, Miss Marple sat with Lady Bantry over cups of properly prepared tea, brewed without drama or deception. Poor Hilda March, Dolly said, shaking her head. Used as a pawn in Sylvia's theatrical ambitions. At least her name will be cleared, though I suppose the tea room is still finished once word gets out about the sugar shortages. Perhaps not entirely finished, Miss Marple replied. I understand Dr. Haydock has suggested she might benefit from proper bookkeeping instruction and a fresh start with honest accounting. The village is surprisingly forgiving when genuine remorse is shown, and Hartley recovering well according to the hospital. His memory of the incident remains clouded, which is perhaps a mercy. He's already demanding his notebook so he can complete his assessments from his hospital bed. Dolly laughed. Some things never change. But tell me, Jane, what was it that first made you suspect Miss Cribb rather than Mrs. March? Miss Marple considered this, her fingers busy with her knitting. Several small things, really. The glycerin was the first indication. Mrs. March had no reason to make her tears appear false unless someone had convinced her it would serve a useful purpose. The whistle P suggested theatrical knowledge that Mrs. March simply did not possess, and the timing of the mechanism required both technical skill and dramatic sensibility. She paused, setting down her cup with careful precision. But what truly convinced me was the performance itself. Miss Cribb was too perfect in her role as the sympathetic friend, too ready with comfort and explanation. Real sympathy is awkward and uncertain. Theatrical sympathy flows with practice, Dees. Like recognizing a professional actress among amateurs, Dolly mused. Precisely. And once I understood that Miss Cribb was performing, I had only to look for what purpose. The tea room location provided the answer. Ambition, you see, can make people quite ruthless, particularly when dressed in artistic pretensions. Through the window, St. Mary Mead settled into evening quiet. The bunting had been taken down, the teapots washed and stored away. The parish hall would host other events, other gatherings, but the memory of that April afternoon would linger in the village consciousness 4 years to come. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, preparing to depart. "Tea is meant to be comfort," she observed, echoing Lady Bantry's words from 2 days prior. Which is precisely why Whiteacup's screams and tears look so very wrong together. They violate the natural order of things. "And the charred thread at the hinge?" Dolly asked. "Told the tale better than any sob," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "Objects rarely lie, my dear. They simply exist, waiting for someone patient enough to read their story." Thethred knew it had been burned. The kettle knew about the whistle pea. The trolley knew exactly how it had been made to fail. One needed only to listen. They walked together into the spring evening, leaving behind the scene of deception and near tragedy. Behind them, the parish hall stood silent and dark, its kitchen equipment resting innocently on shelves and sills. The folding trolley had been stored away, its mechanism repaired, and its story ended. But in St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple well knew, stories never truly ended. They simply waited, patient as objects on a shelf for the next observer sharp enough to read what lay beneath the surface of ordinary.